Hello, welcome to pattern hacking or pattern adapting summer blouses and shirts. I'm Charlotta. I'm a pattern cutter, designer and teacher, and I'm glad you've joined me today. So if you follow me on YouTube or on Instagram, you might have seen I put out a questionnaire of what you want to see today, and blouses, summer shirts came up top, and you love both of them a lot. So I'm going to actually share 10 easy adaptations, 10 easy pattern hacks for blouses and shirts with you. So I'm always going to talk about what is suitable for that and how it will change as well if you use the same technique for a more boxy shirt style or a more fitted blouse. So if you are watching, do say hello. So hello Natalie, how are you? And Natalie, it's quite late at night, and I've just realized a lot of you are joining me from the US, and it's very early in the morning, so thank you very much for making time in your morning routine to join me. It's quite a nice way to start your day, isn't it? Looking at some beautiful clothes. Good morning. Oh, hello Beth, thank you for making it. I think it must be early where you are. And I know Beth had a question about ease, so I'm going to be talking about that later. And hello Erin as well, lovely of you to join me as well. So what I've done, I've got 10 ideas. Some are more blouse related, some are more shirt related. So let's talk a little bit more about what a blouse is in what a shirt is, and they might be also interchangeable depending on where you live, of course, but for me a blouse is maybe slightly more fitted, so I would use a basic bodice block for that. It would have darts, so if you're buying a sewing pattern as well, it probably will have a bit more shaping still to go around your curves. Shirts can have fitting, but in general shirts are more relaxed style, and if you think about where they historically come from, it would be menswear, so quite often they have more relaxed fit, so quite often no bust dart. But of course if you are curvier you might want to add a bust dart, and that's a great thing about making your own. You can have exactly the shape you want, but I think that's the main sort of difference. I think blouses are more probably what we see historically as women's wear, and shirts are more what we see historically as men's wear. And of course that's where it also gets really interesting and fun, because you can pick and choose, mix them up for like a new take on something else and to change the look. All the examples today I have are vintage, but of course depending on how you pattern cut it, or what fabric you use, how you finish it, the fit, the proportions, it can be anything from vintage to contemporary. I always think a lot of the styles are timeless, and how you interpret it really changes the look. So I always think it's like all what vintage means is that you have a lot more styles to choose from. And contemporary sort of, it's quite arbitrary, because it's just what people decide is fashionable at the moment. And at the moment it's roughly the year 2000, so it's sort of a weird cycle anyway. Oh, and hello Deepanshi Jane, and thank you so much. That's lovely that you're learning with me. That's what I want to happen. So I'm going to switch over to my overhead camera. As always, we're not being slick. This will be quite mechanical. And sometimes I do try to be slicker, and it just always ends in tears. So now I'm just embracing that this is quite rustic. It's just me on my table. So the first thing I wanted to look at is collars. So for collars, if I'm really going to sketch out just the sort of basic shapes we're going to work with. So the shirt, as I said, is more relaxed. I'm not going to put any collars in because there's so many variations. So if you're looking for a pattern, sewing pattern, you would look for something less fitted, there might be no darts, it'd be a little bit more boxy, the armholes will be bigger and the sleeves will be wider. And a blouse, by comparison, probably has often narrower shoulders, so often a shirt has a slightly oversized shoulder. And then a blouse might have a slightly curved side seam, so it goes in, while a shirt in general is straight. But of course, there are sort of variations. So I'm drawing like an archetype, but of course there's so many hybrids in between the two of them. And then the shirt quite often has definitely darts here, and sometimes we also have darts there. But of course, a shirt, menswear shirt, depending on fashion, also starts having darts and things. But that's sort of the two shapes we're going to look at today. So let's have a look at collars for these shapes. So the classic collar, of course, for either would be either a classic shirt collar, which sits like that, or a more relaxed, what I call a blouse collar or open collar, which has just a slightly sort of softer edge. So it sort of is quite often worn open and it folds, it lays a little bit flatter. They both can be constructed with separate patterns. You can, of course, there's lots of tutorials out there. There are tutorials for both with fitting on my website, on the pattern cutting school. But there's lots of different options of how to do that. On its most basic, it's a straight strip. And then we shape this edge for our pointy bits, and then we change these angles in different directions for different fits. So that's a sort of basic method of any separate collar in about 10 seconds. But of course it becomes much more interesting if you play around with different collars. So let's have a look for blouses. For blouses, you can have lots of fun. I wanted to show you a really clever one. Okay, let's have a look. This is very vintage. It's very sort of glamorous. It reminds me of a movie star, the blouse. Oh, actually it reminds me of Givenchy. It's like a copy of Givenchy, this style. And I think Natalie will know. Is it the Erica blouse or something? But this is a version. It looks at the front, it looks like a very open, relaxed collar. But at the back, you can see at the center back, it joins open. So it's a little bit, it's a shawl collar hybrid. And it gives you a really, really pretty look there. At the back, you have this really nice detail. Curved, and then at the front it's a sort of pointy soft collar, but of course that can have lots of different angles. But what it does, it's basically a grown-on collar at the front, which gives you a really beautiful soft fold, and then at the back it becomes a separate short collar. So that's a really nice vintage version of adding a collar. And if you're using a pattern you've already drafted yourself or sewing pattern, just make sure you take off a seam allowance. And then you can use a short collar drafting method and just do a curved center back if you want to. And just choose whatever shape you want. But that's a really quick way. And short collars, we all know, are pretty to look at and very easy to draft, and relatively easy to make, apart from that corner, which is always a little bit tricky to stitch. And Natalie saying it's the Bettina blouse from his first collection. Yes, so that's what I was thinking of. It's and it's, I think it's got a really famous photo. But I bet uses the same collar. I should have chosen that as well. But that's a really nice, quick way of using your existing sewing pattern and just changing the collar you want. And staying with shawl collars, of course, you can, as well as this more sort of unusual one, you can also, instead of having a separate collar, you can just have a really nice shawl collar. And I think they always add a completely different look, and they're a little bit softer than separate collars. And again, if you're using an existing sewing pattern, just take off your seam allowance. And of course, you can keep your neck shape as you want, or you can make it narrower or wider. So always think about how you want that shawl collar to sit. Is it really tight like a classic shirt, or is it slightly more open? And Natalie's saying, I have a vintage pattern with a little jacket that has this collar. Ooh, that sounds lovely. Yes, it's a very it's a collar which looks a lot more glamorous and sophisticated than it is actually to make. It's relatively straightforward to make and also to draft. So I've shown you sort of quite big collars like a shawl collar, but of course you can also go quite narrow, and I quite like these really cute collars like this. So instead of having a classic shirt collar, you can also just round off the edges on any of your shirt styles, or alternatively you can use the sailor collar method or Peter Pan collar method. As always, because fashion has been around for so much, we have got lots of names for the same technique, but it's basically a very flat collar. So the classic shirt collar has quite a structured look when we have the open one, which has a more relaxed look. The shawl collar has a really soft edge, and then a Peter Pan or sailor is quite flat. So any sort of flat collar you want, you would use the Peter Pan or sailor collar construction. And again, there is a tutorial on my website. And Natalie's saying, I love a Peter Pan collar, so cute. It is. Well, I think it can be really cute, but what I love about the drafting method, it's a really quick drafting method, which actually has lots of design possibilities. So once you understand the drafting principle, you can add collars such as the Peter Pan collar, sailor collars, or like an easy tailored river panel collar to any style. So it's a really good collar to learn for designing your own clothes, because it's really straightforward, and you can add it to any neckline. And on the website, I have a sailor collar tutorial and also how to do an easy tailored collar from that method, which I love because it takes all the pain out of making tailored collar, and it has a really nice open vintage look. But you can see how you can completely change your look. You keep the neckline as it is, and you can go anything from classic to more glamorous. And with blouses, I would sort of use quite often styles like the Givenchy or the shawl collar, and with shirts quite often you maybe have more a classic separate one. The Peter Pan works for both of them. And with the same Peter Pan method, what you can also do is, sorry, that's not the one I want. Here you go. You can also do a really big glamorous collar. So this is the same method, but instead of being really narrow, you can have a much wider neckline and a geometric style rather than a round style, and it gives you a completely different look. Again, this is sort of vintage, but you can also style it lots of different ways. But you can see same drafting method, completely different look, which is of course what is lovely about it. Oh, Beth says, I have yet to be successful making a good Peter Pan collar that doesn't pop up. Yes, but what I think what Beth means is sometimes if you have a Peter Pan collar, instead of laying lovely and flat like that, you have if I draw the neckline in, you have a Peter Pan collar which sort of is like this, it wants to take off. Is that right, Beth? So it doesn't want to lay flat. It has sort of maybe even, it looks slightly ruffled. And that has to do with your outer edge. And if you have a look at the tutorial on the website, I actually talk about that. It's all to do with our outer edge on the collar, which is all about helping it fit. And if you make it bigger, it becomes more ruffled. And there's a really easy way of making it smaller as well. And yes, best bet is the problem. Yeah, so have a look. It's basically when you start drafting it, you need to make a decision on how wide you want the edge to be. And I think I've also included something on fitting if it happens, because it is a really common problem. I've done that as well. So these are the collar ideas. Another really easy way of changing your style is to add a yoke. And you can, if you watched a few of these, you can see there are sort of certain themes which repeat itself, but which look completely different on what, depending on what you want to draft. And of course, the great thing is whether you're adapting your own patterns or whether you're drafting patterns from scratch, you can then know the techniques and you can see, oh yes, it might look completely different on a shirt, but the technique is exactly the same. So here on this one, on the stripy one, you can see a really beautiful round yoke. It's I think it's a yoke in every country. It's one of those words which is universal. But of course you can have the classic yoke from a shirt. So for a shirt, quite often we have a yoke where the shoulder seam moves slightly to the front, roughly sort of about 5 centimeters, and then on the back, quite often you then have a yoke like that, and that's sort of quite a menswear style. And the yoke at the back roughly goes to your first notch. And then if you look at menswear construction, the yoke can be either one piece on the straight, or what quite often happens is cut on the bias with a center back seam, and that helps with movements. Because if you look at menswear shirts, they've been around for centuries, so there's a lot of expertise. So by looking at it, you can sort of really learn about what makes good fit, what works with movement, the utilitarian garments in the end. So there's been history, like a whole history of what makes these garments work. So quite often the yoke does have the center back seam and the bias for more movement, which sort of ends up being straight of grain on the front. And it also basically, instead of having one shoulder seam, we get a seam at the front, a seam at the back. And I think it's got with it has to do with wear and tear. If you have a seam here, it's like a weak point on the top of the shoulder if you're carrying stuff. So you're basically distributing where the seams are. So that's a really classic style you can add to any existing garment. You just literally draw it in where you want it and create a seam. And if you're an existing pattern, you can literally trace through your pattern, then draw on the yoke and add seam allowance to it. And if you have a back shoulder dart, you can incorporate it in the yoke. There is a tutorial on how to do that in the vintage pattern cutting masterclass, which is also part of the design and draft program, which I've linked to in the description, because I've combined everything I've offered so far and everything I will make in one program. So you can just join me once and then you have access to everything. But yokes don't just have to be classic. There are lots of different ways. So as I said, this is a really beautiful one, a curved one. And if you do a curved one, it's sort of, it hits again. If that is your back, you sort of quite often have it hitting where the back of the shoulder is. And then it can be combined either with a grown-on sleeve, so you change your pattern, or if you want a classic one, if you have a round one, it can be done like that. And then it becomes like a flat collar. It becomes a really nice detail. And then of course what you could do, the one collar I haven't mentioned, is like a really pretty little sand collar, either with a button or with a bow. And that's a really nice way of doing it. So these are two of the yokes. Let's talk about sort of yokes which are purely more ornamental. They're sort of panels, and I wanted to show you a really beautiful one. Let's have a look if I can find it. Yes, have a look at this. This is a Georgia O'Keeffe blouse, and I know a lot of you are properly Georgia O'Keeffe fans as well, and as well as an amazing artist, she also had a very beautiful wardrobe, and she made quite a few of her clothes herself. But they're sort of very color palette in general is quite plain, but then she has lots of really nice details. And this blouse is a really good example of that. So basically by panels, again, we're chopping off our bodice. So again, if you have a existing pattern you're adapting, you just trace it through, and then you can do lots of designs on it. And quite often panels are more at the front, and for blouses you might make it like this, but this also works for shirts. For shirts it has that sort of tuxedo effect, which I think I've got a photo of. No, I don't. But basically you can keep it more geometric, which I think is maybe slightly more simple, or you can also make it a little bit more delicate maybe by making it round. But I think the round also, they both have sort of vintage, but you can also make it contemporary. It can go either way, but as again, it's just adding a panel into it for design lines. And if you have, of course, your darts on a blouse, then you can use dart manipulation, just pivot your darts into that seam if it goes to the bust point, or you can make it narrower and closer or closer. Oh, and hello, Jen, lovely of you to join me. Good morning, or yeah, well, just lunchtime here, and no worries about being late. And thank you for joining me. And Natalie's saying, I love Georgia O'Keeffe's work, and the blouses she made are so delicate. I think there was a lot of hand sewing involved. Yes, definitely. And that brings me... Actually, I'm going to talk about something else, but I'm going to talk about the hand sewing in Georgia O'Keeffe's blouses later. And they're from the 30s quite often, and 40s. And yes, they're very delicate. Even this blouse, if I zoom in for a second... Can you see it's got at the edge of the panel, it's got like a window stitch, or I always forget the name. It's basically where you have little the threads are wrapped around your fabric, and you end up with a window effect or ladder effect, and the whole fabric has got tucks, it's got everything. It's very delicate and beautiful. But that's a really nice way of adapting your shirts or blouses. And it's also, you know, these are quite big, but you can also make it really delicate or little, just like a little effect like that. And of course you can do it at the back as well. There's lots of ways of doing it. If you stay in the area for a second, another way of really adapting your front is to have a look at the button stand. And your classic button stand, of course, would be something like this, and then it's either a separate panel or it's an extension of your bodice, and it looks like that. And again, there are lots of tutorials. Have a look at the garments you own, and there is also a tutorial on my website if you would like to learn more with me. But these are the sort of classic button stands. And grown on, I just mean it's one piece of fabric. But of course you can have lots of fun. So really delicate way, which I would probably use more for blouse or softer fabric, slightly more fitted one, is to do a looped one. And I think I have a lovely vintage example of that. There you go. On this blouse, you can see, I zoom in a little bit. Can you see there's lots of little buttons and they're right on the center front. So of course, when we have a classic button stand, the edge of our pattern moves slightly to one side. Men's wear is different than women's wear traditionally, but it's up to taste, especially if you're left-handed or right-handed. With a looped button stand, you basically keep your top half on the center front, and then you add these little loops and buttons. Sometimes you have to move slightly 2 mil away because you want your buttons to be right in the middle. It's a really lovely sort of vintage styles. It's you see it on bridle, especially vintage bridle, going down the center back, which is really delicate. If slightly a pain to take on and off, but it's actually a really nice detail on the front. And of course you can have really close together, or you can sort of spread them apart a bit. And of course, on Natalie saying the loops are a good idea because button holes give me the fear, or whatever the emoji is supposed to mean. Yeah, it's like, but I think the problem is because, especially if it's on the center front, buttonholes are right in your face. Like you're looking at it all the time, whether you're looking in the mirror or whether somebody else is looking at you. So your buttonholes have to be perfect. And not only does each buttonhole have to be perfect, they have to be exactly the same distance apart, and they have to be exactly the same size. And they can't be wonky or anything because it will really stand out. So they have to be completely perfect and uniform and regimented. I think which is what it makes really tricky. There's like 3 factors playing into it. And of course in industry you have a machine which does the buttonholes, and if you have a fancy sewing machine, it might have a special buttonhole foot where you can lay the button in, and that way it gives the perfect size. But I think quite often it still doesn't get you the same stitch amount as it gives you an industrial affair. So yes, it's like when I do button stands, I do practice them to death, and when I line out, I actually draw on quite often exactly the shape I want in either chalk pen or even pencil, but you definitely don't want to mess that up. So loops are a good alternative because they're you're stitching them into your seam allowance, and then what you do have is you have a facing to tidy it up. You have to experiment a bit of getting exactly the right length of loop for your button. You don't want it to be too big. Often you have to make it slightly tighter because it's a bias tube, basically a little rouleau. So it's a very narrow tube cut on the bias, and which stretches, so you have to make it slightly tighter. So quite often what you actually end up with is that it's literally flat like that, and then the buttons stretch it out. So yeah, do a little bit of experimenting with that it fits the body perfectly. An even easier version of this, and which I've seen quite a lot of sort of contemporary sewing pattern, instead of loops, what you can do is that you have your top side ending at the center front or slightly back, like a few mil back, and then you have ties. And then the other side, I'm going to draw this in black, and then I'm going to draw the other side in red. The other side in red goes underneath like this, and then again it has the ties stitched just on. And at the same level as well. Sorry, I've drawn it far too low to make the difference. But yes, you have it at the same level, and then you tie it. So that's a really nice sort of, I've seen it quite a lot recently. Like you end up with something like that, and you can do sort of quite neat bows, or you can do sort of quite romantic longer bows. Again, it's got quite a lot of historical annotations of how things were tied and things like that. Last option for buttonholes. Actually, I'm going to show you some really pretty ones in a second. But a classic sort of option is a hidden buttonhole, and that makes it looks really smart, because you get the really simplistic look, and all you have is basically either seam or stitch line there, and then you have like a double layered button stand, and your buttons are invisible here. And it's, I think, on it's just a very smart look, because you end up with a completely plain shirt, but it still has a little bit of detail. And Ginger Nusette is that at work I'm trying to keep up. Love you guys. Thank you for joining me despite being at work. Okay, so we talked about button stands. Let's talk about what happens when you have a shorter button stand. So let's talk about sort of keyholes, and I've got a few pretty ones for you to show. So keyholes. Oh, first of all, I wanted to show you a hybrid. This is a very vintage look, very of its time, but can you see this really pretty stripy one there? So if you have a look at keyholes, what you can do is basically a keyhole is just very normally what we have on granddad shirts, that's what they're called, and then instead of button stand going all the way down, it goes halfway up. So classic style is like that, and then it has buttons like this, and then you quite often have a little stand collar. And I think you also get it on quite a lot of Indian style menswear. So if you have the long ones, quite often they have a keyhole opening as well. And I really like that sort of style, because then the lower half of your shirt isn't open. So it's a single garment, so it doesn't move as much. It's a little bit more controlled, because whenever you have a button stand, that whole area, of course, is only connected to buttons, so it moves, it pops open and stuff like that. If you have a keyhole, you can still get your neck, your head in, you got a detail, but then this is a solid garment, so it's maybe a bit more dressed, a bit easier to wear. I'm not sure. I quite like it as a style. It's more like a hybrid between a top and a shirt, and of course you can put like pleats in and stuff like that and play this volume. But what is quite nice about this one is it's sort of a keyhole effect at the top. So the top, they've done like a little bit of paneling. So it's a panel keyhole button effect. And then basically, so this is open here, and then it has the tie there to tie it all together. And then the button stand comes out like this. But of course, that would also be a really nice, simple keyhole effect. But what basically happens, whenever you keyhole at the most basic is a loop, and then it's got a facing or it's got binding. But as soon as you basically go, we always end a point where you're stitching into nothing, which is not that easy, and also means that everything, if you have one stitch wrong, it's going to fray, it's going to show, it's going to have little tucks. So by moving away from it, by adding a little panel there, or by adding a button stand, it basically becomes easy to construct, and it's also less of a weak point. And I have made a tutorial about 3 keyhole button stands, and I will put that in the design archive on the website, which is in the community, and where I just put in all the, because I've now have over 7 years worth of tutorials, so some of them are older, so they're sort of not on my current one. So I put them in the archive, so they're all in one place, because my technique has hopefully improved a bit over the years. It's sort of, I'm still learning how to film, but it's getting a little bit more professional. But these are, if you have an existing pattern with a button stand. These are a really nice way of really changing the look. And all you have to do is on your existing pattern, whether it's self-drafted or bought, take off the existing button stand and mark where the center front is, and that becomes the fold line, and then you can add whatever keyhole style you want. And hello Rebecca, lovely of you to join us. And I think it's in, if you're in the US, is it 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock? It's quite early, isn't it? So thank you for joining me. In the UK, of course, it's lunchtime, and I think most of us, anybody from anywhere else? It'll be afternoon maybe. Okay, so we've talked button stands, keyholes. I do have a list because I have so many ideas and it's always trying to work out what to show you next. Let's talk about gathers. So gathers are just a really nice way of adding volume, or of, instead of having darts with shape, if you add gathers, it basically still allows the garment to flow around the curves, but in a softer, less constructed way. And I know, Beth, you asked about ease in blouses. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send out an email to people on the pattern cutting school and with details on sort of general amounts of ease, blouses, shirts, because they're slightly different. And Rebecca saying it's 6 a.m. Oh my goodness. Well, thank you for joining me. I hope you didn't get up for this. That'd be true dedication to pattern cutting. Okay, let's have a look at some gathers. Oh, and I do love a gather. So this is a really pretty example of a way of using gathers. So can you see the easiest way, of course, of using gathers is instead of having our, sorry, I just realized you can't see anything. The easiest way of adding gathers is instead of having our darts, you have little gathers either at the shoulder, but you can also use dart manipulation and pivoting to, for example, if you had I'm just thinking, if you had a button stand with a panel at the front, you could have the gathers here, for example, as well, which is more feminine. So there's lots of different ways. But what quite often happens if you have gathers, they're combined with a yoke, because if you have gathers right at the shoulder, you really want to stitch them down, and they become more like tucks, and we're going to talk about in a second. But by basically moving our gathers down by adding a yoke, they become more controlled, and they also become more in the bust area. So rather than having it sort of loose right from the shoulder, which we don't, in general we want our shoulder section to be skimming. We don't want lots of volume in the area. So we're adding basically a yoke to move it down, or we stitch it down. So it's a really pretty way of changing your blouse, because that looks completely different to our classic blouse, but it also serves a real practical purpose of where we want our volume to be. And in the Vintage Masterclass, there is the yoke top has exactly that style, and I go through all the steps for drafting the yoke, the gathers, the keyhole, I think, as well, and also how to actually stitch it all together. And Rebecca is saying work today, but I would have gotten up for this anyway. Oh, thank you very much. But quite early. I am impressed. So I just mentioned tucks. So let's have a look at some tucks. And that brings me back to the beautiful Georgia O'Keeffe, which we talked about earlier. And this is a really amazing top. And yes, I think I've done a full draft analysis, which is in the archive, and I've also done a full drafting tutorial for this. And it's hard to see. I'm going to do that on full scale for you in a second. Can you see the whole shoulder section is tiny little pin tucks? So that's a little bit over top, but just to see what you can do. And can you see there's basically lots of little lines going down from the shoulders and down from the center front, and then you've got little bits of volume, and that's basically a classic example of what I mentioned here a little bit. Is but basically what you can do is a tuck is a hybrid between a gather and a dart. So we're basically adding lots of little gathers or tucks, but then they get stitched down. So they're basically tiny pleats, but which are controlled to where we want it. And then you got the volume. So again, they could be at the top, or they could be, let me have a look where this has got it. Sorry, that's not the right one. No, I haven't got a photo. You could also have it, which is really nice for blouses, is to actually have little parallel stitched tucks like that, and then you got the volume here and you got the volume there, and then in a thin fabric makes a classic shape into something a lot more feminine and really beautiful summer blouses. And all it is, again, this is it can be you can pivot your bust dart into it as well, and then also use however much dart shaping dart waist shaping you want. And instead of stitching in your darts, you basically just stitch it like that. So it can be stitched completely straight, or quite often it is actually like a dart shape. So it's a really nice way of actually adding shaping, but it's really delicate, and it also spreads it out across the whole front rather than one dart. And Natalie is saying the fabric on the Georgia O'Keeffe blouse looks like a very transparent muslin. Yeah, we had a whole discussion about this when I made this 3 years ago, maybe. If you're not sure whether it's like a really fine organdy or an organza or very, very fine cotton, because this is from the 1930s and we think it's completely hand stitched. And if you look back at some blouse material from the time, the quality is amazing. It's very thin, but it has to be relatively stable. And I also got comments saying about we want Arabic translations. Yes, I'm sorry, I don't speak Arabic. I think you might be, depending on where you live, you might be able to set up the captions in your country, but I'm not sure. There's nothing I can do from my end. It's basically YouTube. So I think we've enabled it with some content, but unless I translate everything myself, it should be easier nowadays with AI, but it's actually, if you ever want to do captions, you literally have to write it out one by one, and that's quite a lot of work. So let's finish off with something quite feminine, quite fun, which are ruffles. And you can see what I've done today. I haven't really looked at specific designs. It's more sort of drafting variations, pattern hacks, which make all the difference to a shirt. But they're quite small ideas, some of them. But I hope they, give you some inspiration. Of course, also because they're small, they're quite easy to adapt for existing patterns. So all the collars, of course, you can literally just use your pattern and you just make a little twirl of your collar and you add it on. And the yokes, you don't even need to make a twirl. You can just change that. I would actually use some tape and draw it on so you get exactly right. And the panels, again, you can just draw them on And then if you're a bit naughty, you don't actually need a trowel because it will be exactly the same fit, just a different design. And the last thing I'm going to talk about, which is ruffles, is exactly the same. It's a really quick way of adding details. So if you've used, if you, for example, changed the button stand, or you added a panel or yoke, in any of these seams you can put a ruffle. And you can see on the Georgia of Kiev, this one, it's really nice because there's ruffles next to the buttonhole, there's ruffles next to a panel, and there's also ruffles going down the sleeve. So the same drafting method, the same decoration, but used very differently. And I wanted to show you a contemporary version of a similar one looking completely different, which is, I think it's a Japanese, but if I zoom in, can you see it's the same as the Georgia O'Keeffe? It's got ruffles next to the buttonhole, which are pleated, and then a second row of ruffles behind it to give that sort of tuxedo effect. But basically, if let's draw out the shirt. So if you want to have a more boxy shirt, you could, for example, have a separate button stand and then just add a pleated row of fabric, which is, I don't know if it's technically a ruffle, but it's basically a long piece of fabric and you just pleat it, fold it, so it's literally a strip of fabric like this, and then you just pleat it together. And that's a really nice, smart effect. It's the same fabric, it's very subtle, it's not too feminine, it's more smart, interesting. You could also, if you, for example, have a cuff, you could add a little row in there. And quite often you can actually buy this as a finished tape, but you know, you want to make it yourself in self fabric. And again, if you have like a menswear style, you know, you can add a little bit of pleated or ruffle into your yoke. You can add a yoke here. And then the Japanese one, they just added a second wider row next to it and then probably stitched that down because you don't want it to push it out. So by stitching it down, top stitching it, you control it. But you can see they are all quite controlled. They're sort of playing with adding ornamental details to a classic shirt, elevating the style. With a blouse, you know, you can really play with it being more, maybe more feminine, more frilly, a bit more. So for example, if you have a round panel and you add a frilly flounce rather than a pleated one, it makes all the difference. But of course you can also pleat it, and it also depends whether you press it down or whether you leave it loose. And again, if you want to have a button stand on top of that, again, it can be really good fun. And if you want to add it to the top of a sleeve, as the Georgia O'Keeffe is, all you do is slash line, cut your pattern there, add seam allowance, and then in that seam allowance you add your ruffles. And of course, you know, you could have seams going down here, and again adding the frills, which is quite a nice look. And you could use lace instead of ruffles. I think it's always about the scale. If you're going really big, it becomes like a 1970s tuxedo in pink satin maybe. But little scales, pleating, gathering, will make all the difference. And of course, if you want ruffles, you would use a curved piece of fabric, and then you either pin hem the edge, and you can use a really nice zigzag, really tight zigzag stitch, or you can use, again, you can, if you don't want a raw edge, you can use a folded over piece of fabric and then just gather it instead of pleating it. So these are all the different options. And Natalie's saying, we love being naughty when they're pattern cutting. Yes, it's a very, it's just like sort of rebelling. It's a really easy way of rebelling. Just I think it's to be aware of when you can safely rebel. And with pattern hacking, which is why it's like a shortcut of what to call it. I think a lot of designing is pattern hacking, because you've done all the fitting, you drafted it, or if you bought a sort of commercial sewing pattern, you've traced it through, you fitted it, so you know it fits. And when all of the things I covered today, you're not changing the fit. You're just playing around, so you can be a little bit more risque, because you know it won't suddenly be too big or something. You're adding details. Designing, is quite often about the look, is quite ornamental. It's not going into the actual fit, but it has a massive impact. What have you gone through today? You could have a whole wardrobe, and you could make anything from really over top to really subtle. You could do it quite smart, you could do it really frilly. It's up to you, which is of course the great thing. So I had 2 questions before this live stream. One was from Beth, about ease and blouses, so I'm going to send that out, because Beth is on my pattern cutting school. I'm going to send that out with a little chart on sort of average ease amounts to add. And then I had a really good question on Instagram about at which style is best for adapting or making if you're buying a sewing pattern for somebody who's pregnant, which I thought was a great question, because one of those things which is probably covered absolutely nowhere, and it's actually really important. So pregnancy, of course, the changes are not just your stomach grows, but also your whole body might change. So if you're thinking about making a present for somebody who's pregnant, I would definitely make more of a boxy shirt. So if you're looking for sewing patterns, if you're going for a more relaxed style, and then of course what you can do as well, if you want it really oversized, you can actually add a little bit of ease overall. You can add some bit extra gathers or tucks. I think sometimes you have to be careful it doesn't become too voluminous, which is what a lot of classical sort of maternity wear, like a smock, where you sort of, especially I think it's the 80s, the big smocks, which is like just engulfing you. But for example, the buttons that we covered with the ties, but if you put that on a boxy top, that means you could sort of do a little bit more of an overlap. So as different areas grow, you can open it up a little bit more. That would be an option. Or the other option, you make the whole thing a little bit, you could have make the whole thing a bit wider, and then have pin tucks being stitched down, so your volume is down there, and then you could add a tie again, so you can tie it to whatever level you want to. But in general, definitely, the thing is, if you go into blouses, quite often there's more fitting. So 9 months body changes quite a lot. So I would definitely go for a more boxy style, or it depends on the person as well. But quite often when you're pregnant, you don't want to have anything too tight, because I was going to say you can have elastic above the bump as well. But that's still a very sensitive area. So quite often you just want it to be quite loose. So if you're using assisting, if you're looking for sewing patterns, a sort of boxy oversized top. So the one I use for inspiration for this one is, for example, from Sew Over It London. It's their boxy shirt, so something like that, and then maybe widening the side seams a little bit would be perfect. Let's see what people are saying. Carlin is saying, thanks for doing these, they're so helpful. You're very welcome. That's great to hear. I think often is it's just giving little pointers, hopefully, and then you can look either on YouTube, in your books, or on my pattern cutting school and find the tutorials to actually make them. But quite often you learn these skills, and then you're thinking, oh, what should I actually make? So these are more like a it's like a magazine, isn't it? It's giving you inspirations, but also a little bit of information on how to do these. And Miss Jen is saying, she's talking about pregnancy and the sailor collar. Yes, so I think it was a Princess Di who had when she was pregnant, big sailor collar, Laura Ashley floral fabric, and the smock. And it is really comfortable, but maybe not the most flattering. Actually, a really good style, which is on here, which I think I called it vintage shawl collar top, which is a really relaxed boxy top with a little grown on sleeve. That's a really good pregnancy style, and you can make it the bodice wider basically, for a bit of growing room. But in general, it also depends, you know, do you want to wear it for the whole 9 months, or you're gonna only wear it for the last trimester or something? Yeah, but maybe not sailor collars. It might be a bit too much. But I think it's tops are relatively easy. I think trousers and skirts are harder, but dresses and blouses are perfect because they are in general a little bit more relaxed and a little bit more room. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me. I'll be back next week with, I think we're going to do wrap styles because that was really popular in the vote. So thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for watching, and do have a look in the description for more information on how to join me and learning to design and draft your own clothes. And also I will put in some links to specific tutorials I have mentioned today. But have a lovely day for now, and thank you so much for joining me. Bye bye everybody.